The reality on the streets of Baghdad suggests Maliki is either ignorant of what is going on or that his capabilities are not yet sufficient. Stephen Hadley, U.S. National Security Advisor.
Welcome to Inside Iraq. We are talking today to the spokesman of the multinational force, General Bergner, a month before General Petraeus submit his report to the Senate. General Bergner, let me quote you what the president said. He says, "When we catch you playing a non-constructive role in Iraq, there will be a price to pay," in direct reference to Iran. It is my understanding they have been playing a very non-constructive. So what price have they paid so far?
Well, Jassim, we have been very transparent and very forthcoming in talking about the special groups, which are extremist militia elements that have been benefiting from weapons, from training, from funding, and from tactical direction sometimes from special operatives who are advising them. And you know, we have reported on the detention of the former commander of the special groups, Qais Khazali, and we have reported on the detention of a Lebanese Hezbollah operative who was serving as a Quds Force proxy here in Iraq.
Mr. Dakdouk.
So those represent the kinds of operations that we are continuing to conduct inside Iraq. That's correct, Mr. Dakdouk, Ali Musa Dakdouk. And so we are continuing to conduct operations to chip away at those special groups, to chip away at their resources, and to work closely with Iraqi
General,
forces
you know, the
in
president
dealing with this
said
threat to
when we
the
catch
government of
those
Iraq and to our
Iranian
forces.
agents in Iraq, you know, undermining our operations in Iraq, they will be killed. And so far, aside from the 5 people who were captured in Erbil and detained, we don't see, nobody sees, even the Americans a little bit skeptical. What is holding the American forces in Iraq from prosecuting more robustly the action against Iranian agents in Iraq, since you are saying they are undermining our operations in Iraq?
Well, Jassim, actually we are conducting very robust operations. Just in the last few weeks, we have captured or killed some 20 members of these special groups who are connected to these extremist organizations. And 8 of those operations, I would point out, were actually conducted unilaterally by Iraqi security forces. So both Iraqi forces and coalition forces actually are conducting very robust operations against these extremist groups.
And yet, according to Lieutenant General Raymond Odierno, that the EFPs are increasingly coming from Iran. 23 American soldiers out of the 69 that they were killed in July, they were killed by the EFP. So are you saying that the more you are doing from your end, the Iranians are doing even a greater role by supplying these deadly weapons to the militias?
Well, Jassim, what I would say is this is a very tough fight, and it's one where we are continuing to make inroads against those kinds of organizations, those extremist groups that are employing EFPs against our forces and the Iraqi people. We will continue to operate against them, and we will eventually make more progress against them. But it is a tough fight, and it is one where all of the neighbors of Iraq have an opportunity to fulfill their commitments that they have made to help stem the flow of those kinds of resources that are coming to these special groups.
There is something puzzling, General Bergner. It doesn't seem as if you and the Prime Minister al-Maliki see eye to eye about the role of Iran. We heard what you said. We know the exact role they are playing. While he was in Tehran, he said Iran is playing a very constructive role in Iraq. And, you know, that to a very extent, to a large degree, got the president ired. That got him, he said, you know, I have to call my friend and talk to him heart to heart to find out exactly what he means.
Well, Iran has made certain commitments to the government of Iraq, and it would be helpful to see them actually deliver on all of those commitments, and including helping work against these extremist organizations that we have been talking about.
General Bergner, there was a report recently that about 90,000 small arms given to the Iraqi government, to the Iraqi army, are missing. Are we talking about an auditing problem here, or actually these actual weapons somehow left the depots, are in the hands of militias, Al-Qaeda, insurgents, and other places that are attacking civilians as well as allied forces?
Well, first, Jassim, I would tell you that we take the report very seriously, and we are following up on the recommendations that were in that report. But remember back in 2004 and 2005, which was the focus of this report, the circumstance in Iraq was a very difficult one. It was one where there had been a crisis in Fallujah, there was a crisis in Najaf, and then there was another challenge in Fallujah later in that year. And this was a time when Iraqi security forces were still very much a work in progress. They were still developing their own capability to account for this equipment. And so at the one time, on one level, it was important to quickly get the necessary equipment into their hands, and at the same time, start building those systems where accountability could be maintained on the level that it needs to be maintained. We have made great progress since then. In fact, the systems that you look at today in Iraq, you would see that not only is there a very good accountability program in place, but you would see things like biometrics, meaning fingerprints and the retinal scans and all of those other uniquely distinguishing factors are associated with the soldier who draws that weapon, and there's a very much improved record-keeping system underway.
The U.S. forces cannot leave, cannot go home before the Iraqi army stands up. And right now, despite 4 years of a tremendous effort and money spent by the Iraqi government as well as the American government, the Iraqi army is not up to par. When do you reckon that this Iraqi army can assume responsibility, whether shortly to replace perhaps the British as they decide to leave, or with the beginning of the redeployment of the American forces sometimes perhaps middle of next year?
Well, Jassim, the Iraqi army in particular actually is very capable of performing many operations and is doing so on its own in many cases. In fact, where I used to be stationed in my first tour in Iraq, in Nineveh province, the 2nd Division and the 3rd Division of the Iraqi Army are performing very, very well. And they both are led by very effective Iraqi Army Division commanders. The Iraqi Special Operations Forces, a high-end force, if you will, is very, very capable and doing an excellent job. There are other elements, there are other levels of capability. Generally, those units reflect the quality of their leadership, and their leadership is still a work in progress in many cases. But make no mistake about it, the Iraqi forces, Army and police, are fighting bravely. They are suffering losses 3 times the level of the coalition, and they are doing a courageous job in many cases of protecting the Iraqi people. Much work still to be done, but much progress being achieved as well.
General Bergner, let's take an overarching view. Baghdad, as of this moment, is not secured. Perhaps the number of deaths has lessened to a big degree, but the fighting and perhaps the militias, they have moved south. And before those militias are disarmed and perhaps rehabilitated, if not crushed, Iraq will never be safe. And right now, the understanding from the American army that Muqtada al-Sadr, the leader of JAM, the leader of Jaysh al-Mahdi, is not in control of his militias. He's perhaps in Iran. How do you see the next phase of taking out the militias? Do you have sufficient forces in order to take the battle to them in the south?
Well, actually, the Iraqi security forces, to include the 8th Iraqi Army Division and the 10th Iraqi Army Division that are operating in those kinds of areas, are doing exactly the kinds of operations you described. And under the leadership of people like General Othman, who commands the 8th Iraqi Army Division, they're being quite effective, actually, in dealing with some of these criminal elements, these criminal militia elements that you described. And so there are operations underway, and they will continue to be enabled by the coalition forces as well.
Let me combine 2 questions in one, if I may, because I don't have much time. Is the Iraqi army a nationalist army, or has it been cleansed of its sectarianism? And when Petraeus goes to the U.S. Senate, will he give a positive report or a negative report? In 1 minute, General Bergner.
Well, the Iraqi army is very much a national institution. They recruit nationally. Their soldiers represent a significant diversity of the Iraqi people, and they are very much a national force. And to your second question, Jassim, when General Petraeus accompanies Ambassador Crocker back to Washington, he has said he will provide a comprehensive and forthcoming assessment of places where there has been progress and places where there may not have been as much progress. But it will cover the circumstances on the ground at the point in time which he goes back to report.
Brigadier General Kevin Bergner, spokesman of the multinational force in Iraq, thank you for being our guest on Inside Iraq. To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Goodbye.